In this 3-part series, we are going to investigate life. What do we mean by life? What is the origin story of life here on Earth? And then we will put it all together in a coherent framework that we can deploy to think about life beyond Earth, everywhere else in the universe. Does it even exist at all? These are the types of questions that we aim to answer. And so we can start off with using a working definition for life that comes from NASA. And we are going to use NASA because they are at the forefront of exploring life beyond Earth. And so their definition is life is a self-sustaining chemical system that undergoes Darwinian evolution. And now this working definition, which is just a popular term that we use, it's not a scientific term, and it's often attributed to Gerald F. Joyce, who was working for an exobiology discipline working group at NASA over a decade ago, I believe, was when they formulated this. Him and several other people, several other experts sat down, started brainstorming, working on ideas of what should be fit into this definition. And they settled on things, they got rid of other things, and finally culminated on a consensus that was the definition I just stated. Now, he doesn't want to claim credit for this because it was a communal effort at NASA, and that I think is acceptable. So that's where we will begin. And I want to use a very specific example in this first episode, a life form, an organism that's often overlooked, but is extremely valuable and interesting when you dive deep into how it lives. And that is grass. So where does grass fall in the pecking order of life? Where is it classified? Well, we can start off with the 3 domains of life, and that's where scientists have worked hard, biologists have worked hard to delineate life, the very earliest life forms. And it's split into bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. And eukaryotes is where we'll start. Eukaryotes are membrane-bound cells, multicellular, and they're unique in their features. And let's see how we can get to grass, or the Latin name Poaceae. So eukaryotes, with their membrane-bound organelles and flexible cell surface, can be broken down into 4 components: animals, fungi, plants, and protists. Now, animals and fungi are more closely related to one another than they are to plants and protists, respectively. A unique trait for fungi is, and what makes them the fungi, is the absorptive heterotrophy, the ability to excrete enzymes into their external environment so that they can associate with nutrients that the fungi need. And so then the fungi reabsorb that enzyme with the nutrients attached, and they can develop and grow. Protists are a term that scientists use to, cover a broad range of different organisms without a formal clade being part of that unique term. And then animals, you and I, with all its diversity, have a unique trait in that we have collagen in our extracellular matrix. But obviously we are going to focus on that branch that says plants. And from plants, we can branch into algae. Now, like protists, algae is just this term that encompasses all the plant organisms that don't fall under the formal definition of land plants. But land plants is where we want to go. And land plants can be broken down into 4 major categories, with the outgroup being non-vascular plants, and that can be branched off into vascular plants. So these 2 options are both seedless. However, vascular plants can also be seed plants, and they have 2 subcategories known as gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms do not flower, while angiosperms do flower. And of course, that means we have reached our end destination of Poaceae, a angiosperm vascular plant. So without any more delaying, why don't we just jump right into self-sustaining and what we mean by that. And so it starts with replication. The life form has to be able to replicate. It has to be able to grow. And then if it's able to do those two things, it can reproduce. And then it can have even more growth, and it can consume resources to maintain homeostasis or its body or its form, so it can live. And this is what we mean by self-sustaining. And more specifically, if we jump into replication, we can think about what do we mean by this. And we have, here on Earth, all life forms have an instruction manual known as DNA, or maybe more crucially, RNA, which signals and tells the cell how to be structured, how to behave. It creates the proteins that create the structure of the cell, and it deploys these proteins to perform many, if not all, functions of the life form. And then it can proliferate. These cells can proliferate into different structures and make up bones and leaves and all of the necessary components to give structure and order to a life form, as we see here on Earth. And so why don't we think about grass as our example, and we can look at an angiosperm life cycle. And we can start off with the sporophyte, which is like the flower you can think of. And the sporophyte for grass is monoecious, meaning it can be broken into a single flower. You can have both the female and male reproductive organs. And so that's different than the familiar humans. Also, they develop seasonally. So these reproductive organs aren't a permanent part of the body structure. They actually grow and develop seasonally, and then disappear later on, which is fascinating. And so we have the anther and the stigma. The stigma is more of the female component, and the anther is more of the male component. And that's because the anther is what produces the pollen. And pollen is like this little ball that will fly across, the air due to wind, because grass primarily relies on wind pollination, whereas, other flowers and other angiosperms might rely on insects or birds or other animals to carry this pollen to a different piece of grass so that it can fertilize and reproduce. Grass also can self-pollinate, which I will come back to in a moment. But cross-pollination is when the pollen comes across and it sticks to the stigma, which is more of the female portion of the grass. And this female portion is called the megagametophyte. And once the microgametophyte, which is the pollen, and sometimes my girlfriend calls me the microgametophyte, it attaches to the stigma, and then it grows this tube, the pollen tube, into the style of the stigma of the angiosperm, and sperm can move down this tube and meet with an egg, and then fertilization, double fertilization in this case, can take place. So just like humans, these grass and plants all rely on DNA and RNA, which goes through the reproductive process. Once it's fertilized, it can make a seed, and this seed will grow into a new flower. And this will proliferate all over the place, and that's what we see when we see a lawn or grass, a pasture, farmland, all very valuable land plants that we are describing here. And where does this all lead us? We have our self-sustaining component, but this actually leads to Darwinian evolution, because we can come back to the self-pollination portion now. This is actually not ideal for grass to self-pollinate, because you get restricted or very limited diversity, genetic diversity in the grass. And so if environmental conditions change even just a little bit, that ununique structure or development or traits, the phenotypes of the grass, won't help it survive. And so it's actually beneficial from a natural selection perspective, and in this case what we're calling Darwinian evolution, to cross-pollinate, so you can have a genetic diversity. So if there is a change in the environmental conditions, the plant will actually adapt better and survive and continue reproducing. And so these two components, self-sustaining and Darwinian evolution, are crucial to understanding a life form. And that leaves us with the last piece of the puzzle, chemical system. And now a chemical system is any system that utilizes chemical reactions in order to transfer energy, and this is the key point, in order to perform work for a purpose. And this is kind of ambiguous if you really think about it. But we can continue using our grass example to explain it. So grass uses photosynthesis, like all plants do, and that they require energy from the sun, UV radiation, and a handful of oxidation reduction reactions in order to eventually end up with glucose. And then the plant uses that glucose, breaks it down for energy in order to continue functioning and producing all of the processes that the plant relies on to continue living. Similarly, humans require several different metabolic pathways as well, such as glycolysis, TCA, the electron transport chain. All of these are ways in order to form chemical reactions, specifically in order to create or transfer energy in the form of ATP. And then the body uses, or cells use, ATP as a form of energy to continue doing its processes, creating proteins and functioning properly so that we can continue to live. We can contrast this with combustion reaction, which requires oxygen and a spark, and then it creates an explosion of thermal energy and releases the form of CO2, and engines use this to transfer this into mechanical energy, pushing the piston and then rotating the crankshaft and then ultimately rotating the wheels so your car moves. So this is a purpose, this is a chemical system, but we never call engines living or cars living. So what's the difference? The difference is we are the impetus for that engine doing what it is. We gave it purpose. It didn't have inherent purpose like cells do. We don't give cells purpose. The cells give us actually purpose, if you really think about it. And the other thing is combustion reaction doesn't change over time. It doesn't have different traits that it experiences. It doesn't reproduce, and it doesn't self-sustain itself. And there's no Darwinian evolution. So it misses the two important terms we've already described. And that is the difference. And so if we put all of this together, we have ourselves a very specific and robust definition for exploring, to use while we explore for life beyond Earth. But is that the whole story? Does that encapsulate everything we need? I think there's more to think about than that. And I will do that in the next episode. So stay tuned.